Well, good morning, class. This is Mr. Burns. Today we're going to talk about World War I, and specifically we're going to start talking about World War I leaders, so let's just jump right into things. Moving forward in my slides, the first leader we want to talk about is Franz Ferdinand. He's pictured here in an automobile with his wife Sophie. He is not a leader yet. He's the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and he visited the city of Sarajevo, and while he was there, he was murdered. And his murder is going to be a trigger that leads to the start of World War I. So what happened was a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip had jumped up on the running board of the Archduke's car, and he had fired bullets, killing the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, which leads to a huge diplomatic crisis. This was in June 1914, and eventually the government of Austria-Hungary is going to declare an ultimatum against Serbia. The two countries are going to go to war, and then what happens is the alliance system that was in place is going to lead to a greater war between all the countries of Europe. So let's keep moving on. And the next leader we have a picture here of King George III of England. He's a constitutional monarch. That means he has limited power. The really weird thing is he is a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm, that's the German leader, and also of Zar Nicholas II, who is the Emperor of Russia. So he was new to the throne. He'd been king for only 4 years, but he was a great symbol for the country, and he kept the people calm, and they rallied around the monarchy and supported the war effort. Now, 3 years into the war, a really interesting thing happened in England, that his family got rid of their German house name, which was called Saxe-Coburg, and they replaced it with a more English-sounding name called Windsor. So the ruling family of England had a strong connection to Germany, and their house name had once been a German name, so they dumped it in 1917. Let's go to the next slide. This is David Lloyd George. He is the Prime Minister of England from 1916 to 1922. So this is the man making the decisions about the country and the war. And a couple of things that he did correctly is he helped to organize and grow the British Army. Their army was always kind of small. Their navy was what was their powerful part of their military. And he also got English factories to ramp up war production. So World War I was an intensive drain on the resources of all the countries that were involved. So Lloyd George did a good job of managing the country's resources, and as a member of the Triple Entente, he kept the Allies together and focused on fighting and winning the war. And eventually, things are going to pay off for Britain. Here we have a picture of the French Prime Minister. His name is Georges Clemenceau, and Clemenceau took over at a time of great crisis. Britain and France seemed to be losing the war, but Clemenceau helped to rally the French people, and he was very fierce in wanting to determine to keep fighting the war no matter how much the French had been losing. Because of his power and forcefulness, the French people had a nickname for him, and that was the Tiger. He's going to help shore up France until the Americans can come in 1917. So the Tiger, at the end of the war, he kind of hosts the peace treaty, which is going to end up in a treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, and the Allies in Paris wanted to make sure that Germany was punished and kept weak so that it could never start another war in Europe again. Let's go to the next leader, and we'll just touch on him very briefly. This is Franz Joseph. He is the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Now, he was quite elderly and feeble when the war started in 1914. He's going to die in 1916. In many ways, the Austria-Hungarian Empire was just like Franz Joseph. It was coming apart at the seams. There were many ethnic groups inside that empire, and one of them was the Serbs, that kind of helped lead to this war with the murder. Many of these ethnic groups wanted to break away and form their own little countries or join in with the countries that surrounded the empire. He has little to do with planning the war, and he's going to die in 1916. For its part on the battlefield, the Austria-Hungarian army lost most of the battles that it fought in. So Austria-Hungary was quite a weak country in the war. The first country to crack, however, is going to be Russia. And this is Zar Nicholas II. He's the autocrat of all the Russians. So soon after the war begins, it goes terribly for the Russians. Russia was very backward. Zar Nicholas decides he will take personal command of the army. At first, this is kind of a positive thing for the Russians, but as battles are lost with Germany, criticism is heaped upon the Tsar, and he's not able to rally the country. He's not able to turn things around. And like I said, Russia's the first country to break, and that happens in 1917. There is a revolution, and Tsar Nicholas is overthrown. He doesn't leave the country. He is sort of a political prisoner, and the new government is going to be led by the communists that were called Bolsheviks, and eventually they're going to decide that it's too dangerous to keep the Tsar around, and they are going to bring his wife and his family to a small village, and they're going to execute the family. So he has a terrible ending, and the Romanov family comes to a bloody end in World War I. Which brings us to, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He is the autocrat. He is the emperor of the German Empire, and he's going to lead that country from 1888 to 1918. I have a wrong date in there. He is in charge of Europe's strongest army. He's building a very powerful navy to challenge the British, and his economy is growing fast. He sort of wants a place in the sun for Germany. He is kind of an aggressive man, and he's kind of an impulsive leader, and he's viewed as a threat by both Germany and England. Now, keep in mind that the Kaiser is a cousin to King George of England and Zar Nicholas. In fact, in the days leading up to the war, Zar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm are going to exchange letters about trying to back off and prevent the war from happening at the last minute, but these efforts all fail. What's going to happen is that finally, after 4 long years, the Americans have come into the war, and these fresh troops and fresh resources put a lot of pressure on Germany. The sailors are going to revolt. The revolt is going to spread throughout the country, and the Kaiser is going to abdicate. He's going to leave his throne, and Germany is going to ask for an armistice. So his role and his rule comes to an end in 1918. Here's our final leader, Woodrow Wilson. He is the American president. He had been elected president in 1912, and when the war started in 1914, he wanted to keep the United States neutral. That means we wanted to stay out of the war, and he's going to be able to do that for 3 long years. What brings the United States into the war is we had a strong connection to the Allies, and we'd been selling them lots of weapons. So we had an economic interest in seeing England and France win the war. Also, Germany started using unrestricted submarine warfare, and they started sinking a lot of ships in the Atlantic, and some of these ships were American ships, or they were full of American passengers, and that caused the U.S. to jump into the war. He's going to go to Paris, Woodrow Wilson will, to help craft the peace at the end of the war. Remember, that's the Treaty of Versailles that I mentioned earlier. His big thing is to create a League of Nations. He thought this would keep wars from happening in the future. The League of Nations is going to be a failure. It's the grandpa of the United Nations that we have today. And when Wilson comes back from Europe, he isn't able to persuade the Senate to approve the Versailles Treaty. He's going to try to go around the country and get the American people to pressure the Senate into signing this treaty, but he exhausts himself, and in October 1919, he's going to suffer a serious stroke, which really disables him. But he's still president from 1919 to 1921, and his chief of staff and his wife kind of ran the government there. How sick he was, the country knew he had a stroke, but they did not know how badly he had been disabled by that stroke. So this kind of leads to a future constitutional crisis, and his illness many years later is going to be discussed when the country comes up with the 25th Amendment. So these were the leaders of World War I. I might have you watch this video or rewind and watch parts of the video many times. This is Mr. Barnes, signing off.